Hey guys, tonight we are going to slip quietly into a chamber where the glow of lanterns leans across the walls and the scent of old incense still lingers in the carved wood. It feels as though someone has just left the room, though the dust tells you it has been centuries. Tonight we'll walk among the scrolls that carried China's strangest secrets, words said to predict the rise and fall of dynasties. Imagine being told that the fate of your entire empire, your throne, your family, the city around you was already written down. Some emperors believed it, some common villagers clung to it, and one of the most haunting truths is that a few verses seem to come true. Do you dare follow them with me? You won't survive the suspense if you don't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love if you shared your location and the time where you are right now. Midnight in Toronto, early morning in Sydney, late evening in Buenos Aires. Together we make a constellation of little lanterns around the world, and it always makes this space feel warmer. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first step of our walk is simply noticing how quiet it feels here. Silence is never truly empty. It's full of things not being said. That was exactly how ancient courtiers described the atmosphere of prophecy. The Chinese word for prophecy, sanmi, was sometimes translated as hidden verse or sacred whisper. To read it was to step close to the edge of a dream, to feel history rehearsed before it arrived. You can almost picture a young scholar in his layered silk robes, fingers trembling as he touches a brittle parchment older than the stones beneath his feet. On that parchment are lines that sound like poetry, yet each could be a warning, a promise, or a curse. One verse might speak of a red bird flying west, another might describe a dragon changing its scales. In isolation they are harmless, almost pretty, but once you put them in the mouth of an anxious official and whisper them in the right corridor, they begin to feel like weapons. Imagine if a verse hinted that a crown will be lost when the pearl is gone. For a dynasty whose emblem was the pearl, the suggestion alone was enough to send hearts racing. The strange part is that both emperor and peasant believed. For a villager, the prophecy was comfort. If times were hard, heaven promised a better age. For an emperor, the same prophecy could be terror. Perhaps the heavens had chosen someone else already. Words that simple could shift policy, spark punishments, or ignite hope in a village firelight gathering. As we walk further down this corridor, let your eyes follow the murals. Do you see the faint outlines? Dragons painted in fading vermilion, phoenixes in pale gold. Each image is a reminder that symbols always carried double weight in China. Dragons were not just animals. They were the emperor himself. Blossoms were not just pretty. They foretold seasons of peace or decline. And so the culture was ready eager, even for words that would blur poetry into prophecy. You might be wondering, were these prophecies really supernatural? Or were they clever inventions that took advantage of fear and hope? The truth is slippery. Some verses were undoubtedly crafted to sway rulers, handed over at just the right time. Others, however, were kept in temple archives, seemingly dormant until history itself unfolded in a way that matched. That duality, half human trick, half uncanny coincidences, what makes them so magnetic even today. Picture yourself standing at the end of a palace corridor, hearing the night drums echo outside, knowing that your life might change if you reveal a line from a scroll. Would you keep it to yourself? Or would you speak it and risk shaping the fate of an empire? That was the daily question for many courtiers who handled these texts. The story you're about to hear isn't just one of dusty poems. It's a story of dynasties leaning on whispers, of rebels waving verses like banners, of common folk repeating lines in the dark to give themselves courage. And behind all of it is a single thread, the belief that the world was not random, that heaven had left a script somewhere, and that if you could just read it, you might survive tomorrow. And as strange as this might sound, think of it like scrolling a feed today. You see a vague post, and somehow you feel it's about you. Ancient prophecies worked the same way, flexible enough to fit, powerful enough to stick. That's why they carried so much force across the centuries. And yet, behind this quiet we've just stepped into, something gentler is beginning to stir. For if the whispers of prophecy had such power, we need to ask, how did they begin? Why did people first start writing their fate in poems and diagrams? The answer lies not in any single scroll, but in a concept so deeply rooted in Chinese thought that it shaped politics, ritual, and even family life. The mandate of heaven. And if you stay with me, there's a final revelation waiting at the end-known secret, about these prophecies that changes the way we see them altogether. The lanterns seem to dim as we step further in, and the hush that surrounds us deepens. Tonight, we arrive at the very foundation of why prophecy mattered at all in China, the mandate of heaven. To understand why emperors trembled at poems and why peasants whispered verses by firelight, we need to understand this ancient concept, as invisible as the air yet as heavy as a crown. The mandate of heaven was not written in any law, nor carved on any stone. It was a belief that the right to rule came from heaven itself, bestowed like a gift, but also revocable like a debt. A dynasty could rise because heaven favored its virtue, but should floods come, or famine, or rebellion spreading like wildfire, then people said heaven had withdrawn its support. It was not enough to be strong. One had to appear chosen. And prophecy, with its riddles and diagrams, became the language of heaven's hints. Imagine an eclipse darkening the sky above the capital. To modern eyes, it is an astronomical event, predictable, natural, but to a Tang or Han court, the eclipse was a heavenly reprimand. Ministers scrambled to prepare explanations. Scrolls were searched for lines that spoke of the dragon swallowing the sun or a shadow across the jade disk. To find those words and present them at court was not idle. Scholarship, it was a way of showing that heaven had spoken and that the empire must listen. It's a little like when we today see a breaking news alert on our phone. Some people scroll past, others gasp, others use it to argue for change. In the same way, the mandate of heaven turned natural disasters into cosmic tweets from above, short, alarming, open to interpretation. The words of prophecy filled the comment section, each reader seeing what they wanted to see. This belief gave power to the most fragile things, poems. A line about a river swelling could be cited as proof that heaven was warning of rebellion. A drawing of a withered tree could be offered to explain a sick emperor. In each case, the prophecy was not a prediction waiting to come true, it was an explanation waiting to be used. By fitting events into the language of heaven's favor or anger, the empire gave meaning to chaos. And yet, it wasn't only the court that felt this weight. Villagers struck by flood or plague also whispered, "The dynasty has lost heaven's mandate." They might not know the emperor's name, but they knew heaven's displeasure when they saw it in empty granaries and dead fields. In this way, prophecy was democratic in its own strange fashion. The same eclipse that worried the throne also worried the peasant's hut, and both reached for the same verses to understand their fear. One of the most haunting aspects of the mandate of heaven was how it tied morality to power. If an emperor ruled wisely, heaven showed approval with good harvests and peace. If he became cruel, heaven responded with disasters. You can imagine how dangerous this was. Any accident, any drought, any bad season could be taken as proof of unworthiness. And so prophecy was both shield and sword. Emperors leaned on favorable verses to prove their virtue. Rebels leaned on ominous ones to argue the throne was doomed. Picture yourself as an emperor, hearing reports of locusts in the north, famine in the south, and a comet blazing across the sky. Your advisors whisper that the Tuibeitu contains a verse about flames riding the tail of a star. What do? Dismiss it? Or do you act, fearing that if you ignore the verse, heaven will make its displeasure louder? Such was the constant anxiety of power in China. For the people, the mandate of heaven also offered hope. However bad things were, the suffering was not random. It meant change was coming, that a corrupt ruler would fall, and a new one, blessed by heaven, would rise. In this way, prophecy softened despair. It said, "Endure, because the wheel of heaven always turns." That comfort was powerful enough to keep millions steady through years of hardship. And yet, the mandate of heaven was never clear. It did not shout. It whispered, through poetry and rumor, through eclipses and scrolls. And into this fertile soil grew the most famous collection of prophecies in Chinese history, the Tuibeitu, the thrusting back diagram. 60 drawings, 60 riddles, 1,000 years of fear and fascination. Some read it and trembled. Others read it and found courage. But all agreed it seemed to know too much. And, remember, at the end of our journey tonight, there's one last revelation that will cast these whispers in a different light. For now, let's unroll the scroll of the Tuibeitu together and see what secrets it claims to hold. The lantern light narrows, drawing your attention toward a scroll resting on a carved table. Tonight, you and I lean closer to one of the most mysterious works ever produced in China, the Tuibeitu, the thrusting back diagram. Its name alone stirs curiosity. Why pushing back? What exactly was being resisted? Fate, power, or perhaps the truth itself. Legends trace its origin to the Tang dynasty, when Emperor Taizong, unsettled by omens, asked two renowned figures Li Chunfeng, an astronomer, and Yuan Tiangang, a mystic, to calculate the empire's destiny. Imagine the two of them in a candlelit chamber, the inkstone cool, the brushes heavy with dark liquid. Outside, Chang'an shimmered, as the capital of a world empire. Inside, two men dared to draw the course of centuries. What they created was not a plain list of predictions. It was a gallery, 60 illustrations, each paired with a short verse. To the casual eye, the drawings seemed almost childish, simple figures of riders, towers, or wandering shapes. The verses, too, were brief, often no more than a couple of lines. Yet behind this simplicity lay an uncanny power. As time passed, readers returned to the book and claimed to see their own age mirrored in its cryptic images. One diagram, with fire spreading from the west, was said to foretell the devastating Anlushan rebellion. Another, showing a scholar with books, was read as predicting the Song dynasty's rise. Later still, when Mongol horsemen thundered across the land, people saw them in the image of bow-wielding riders beneath foreign skies. Even the Ming and Qing dynasties seemed to find their fates tucked inside its pages. Each new crisis became proof that the Tuibeitu had already spoken. It's not so different from how people today search old science fiction novels or movies, pointing to scenes that predicted smartphones or space travel. Once something has happened, we bend vague words backward to make them fit. But for those living centuries ago, without hindsight, the match felt eerie, like heaven itself had carved hints into the fabric of time. Imagine, for a moment, a rebel leader in the crumbling days of the Ming. He unfurls the Tuibeitu before his followers, pointing to a verse about the fallen sun. Ming, after all, meant brightness. The crowd murmurs. The symbolism is too neat to ignore. Hearts ignite with conviction. Meanwhile, in the Qing court that followed, emperors also turned to the same scroll. For them, a different verse promised heaven's blessing, proving their right to rule. The same text, the same lines, now weaponized by opposite sides. That was the genius and the danger of the Tuibeitu. It was endlessly flexible. Like a mirror clouded with steam, it reflected whatever fear or hope a reader carried. Emperors used it to confirm their reign was legitimate. Rebels used it to prove the throne was cursed. Common people used it to reassure themselves that hardship would pass. The scroll never contradicted anyone, because it never said anything plainly. And yet, despite this ambiguity, the Tuibeitu inspired genuine awe. People whispered that Li Chunfeng and Yuan Tiangang had glimpsed heaven's ledger, a record of centuries, and had only dared reveal part of it. Others said the diagrams were deliberately cryptic, designed so that the future could be seen only after it had arrived, never clearly before. Like a riddle that made sense only in hindsight, it left readers trapped between belief and doubt. Picture yourself sitting by lamplight, turning a fragile page. The ink faded, but the outline still visible. The verse beside it mentions a rider who comes from beyond the borders. You know, rumors of foreign armies at the frontier. Do you take it as warning? Do you tell your neighbors? Or do you keep it to yourself, haunted by the idea that you have just glimpsed the empire's doom? That quiet unease is the soul of the Tuibeitu. Not certainty, but suspense. It shaped behavior, not because it was clear, but because it was cloudy. And that suspense stretched across dynasties, as the scroll survived fire, theft, and suppression, always resurfacing when the empire trembled. And still, even this was only the beginning. For not all prophecies came in diagrams. Some took the form of delicate verses, as fragile as petals, yet sharp enough to wound dynasties. They would come to be known as the Plum Blossom poems, gentle in name, devastating in implication. The hush of the corridor shifts again, and now the air seems laced with the faint perfume of blossoms. As we step further, petals drift in our imaginations oft, pale and fragile against the weight of history. Tonight, we lean into the verses known as the Plum Blossom poems, or Meihua Shi. Their name sounds delicate, but their effect was anything but gentle. For centuries, people swore these fragile lines carried the power to predict the very turning of dynasties. The story begins in the northern Song dynasty, with the philosopher and poet Xiaoyong. He was a man fascinated by numbers, cycles, and the hidden rhythms of the universe. To his followers, he was more than a scholar, was a sage whose gaze seemed to pierce beyond the present moment. One evening, as legend tells it, Xiao sat beneath a blooming plum tree. Watching the blossoms fall, he murmured verses that captured not just beauty, but the unfolding of time itself. From these musings grew the Plum Blossom poems. The poems themselves were short, hauntingly brief, like riddles written in moonlight. They spoke of rivers swelling, shadows stretching, birds soaring, flames flickering out. On the surface, these were images of nature. But readers believed each symbol carried deeper meaning. A river for armies, a shadow for rebellion, a flame for a dynasty burning low. The poems, copied and recopied, spread quietly through literati circles, then seeped into common memory. During the late Ming, when the dynasty strained under corruption and unrest, people turned anxiously to these verses. One poem spoke of a bright flame that burns low, only to vanish in smoke. Ming, of course, meant brightness. To many, it was impossible not to see the connection. As the empire wavered, the line felt less like poetry and more like confirmation. Heaven, it seemed, had already declared the dynasty's end. When the Qing swept in from the north, their conquest was read in another verse. A guest from the north plants roots in the central plain. Ming loyalists grieved at the recognition, while Qing supporters embraced it as heaven's seal of approval. The same verse became both wound and justification, depending on who read it. Once again, prophecy proved its double-edged nature. But the poems also offered something gentler, especially to ordinary readers. They reminded people that history moved in cycles. Like the seasons, just as winter yielded to spring, decline would yield to renewal. To reflect on them by candlelight was to feel both sorrow and comfort, as though every hardship was simply one phase of a larger pattern. In a world where chaos often felt endless, the Plum Blossom poems whispered, "Nothing is eternal, not even despair." Imagine sitting in a scholar's study, the lamp burning low, while outside plum blossoms tremble in the night breeze. You hold a scroll with a verse that speaks of new growth after a long frost. For a weary heart, those words were not just prediction, they were medicine. And for rulers, they were opportunity. To align yourself with the poem's hopeful lines was to claim heaven's smile. To silence its darker verses was to deny heaven's warning. In this way, the Plum Blossom poems became both spiritual reflection and political tool. They soothed common folk, they armed rebels with rhetoric, and they gave dynasties a mirror in which to see themselves. Their beauty lay in their ambiguity, which let each generation find its own meaning. But as blossoms fade, so too did softness. In the corridors of the Ming, another prophecy began to circulate home with a name far less delicate. It was called the Xiaobingge, the burnt cake song. Where blossoms offered fragile comfort, this prophecy gave only the smell of smoke, the warning of ruin baked into its charred edges. The lantern flame bends lower, and with it, the fragrance changes. Gone is the sweetness of plum. In its place comes the earthier scent of bread baking, its edges singed, smoke curling upward as a warning. This is the world of the Xiaobingge burnt cake song. Unlike the elegant imagery of blossoms or stars, this prophecy wore a homely name, and yet its verses struck at the heart of an empire. The tale begins with Zhu Yuanzhang, the peasant-turned-monk who fought his way to the throne and founded the Ming dynasty. He had endured hunger, war, and betrayal, and his reign carried the weight of a survivor determined never to let fate slip from his grasp. One day, according to legend, he sat with his trusted advisor Liu Bowen. On the table between them lay a simple flatbread, its surface burned around the edges. Zhu chuckled and asked whether the fate of the world could be seen in such a humble thing. Liu Bowen, famed for his sharp mind and strange foresight, took the jest as serious. From that moment, he began to spin verses that likened dynastic destiny to the charred bread before them. Thus was born the burnt cake song. At first glance, the verses were plain. They spoke of flames flickering, of a tall tree hollowing at its roots, of clouds gathering after clear moonlight. But to those who read them in later years, these images were hauntingly apt. The bright moonlight was said to symbolize the early brilliance of the Ming. The thick clouds foretold corruption and decline. The tree with eaten roots warned of rot within the court itself. Each line seemed to echo the empire's slow unraveling. Imagine the anxiety of a loyal minister reading these words in the Middle Ming period. Eunuchs gained influence, emperors withdrew into pleasure, and rebellion smoldered on the edges of the land. With each troubling report, the burnt cake song seemed to stir, its lines fitting too well. Ministers might whisper, "Is this not the hollow root? Is this not the cloud after brightness?" And even if they wished to dismiss it, the prophecy clung to their minds like the smell of smoke on clothes. For the common people too, the burnt cake song carried meaning. It told them no dynasty, however grand, could last forever. If the rulers failed in virtue, heaven would scorch them as surely as fire blackens bread. To hear that truth was both fearsome and oddly comforting. Their suffering was not random. It was part of heaven's pattern. The bread would burn, yes, but only so that something new could rise from the ashes. What made this prophecy particularly dangerous was its supposed author. Liu Bowen was no anonymous hermit. He was one of the most respected minds of his age. To attach his name to the verses was to lend them authority beyond doubt. Whether Liu truly wrote them or not almost didn't matter. His reputation ensured the words would be repeated, trusted, and feared. Picture, if you will, a weary scholar at the dynasty's twilight. His lamp burns low. The treasury is empty. Soldiers mutter about desertion. The burnt cake song rests unrolled before him, its lines stark in the candlelight. 30 years of bright moonlight, then clouds gather thick. He closes his eyes, and for a moment the line feels less like poetry than inevitability. His grief deepens, yet so too does his strange comfort. At least it had all been foreseen. Such was the cruel paradox of prophecy. It warned of danger, yet it reassured by giving meaning. It terrified rulers, yet it steadied peasants. Even in the shape of a burnt cake, heaven's voice or the clever words of men could be heard. But the Ming was not the only dynasty to tremble at prophecy. Beyond these halls of power, in lonely temples and roadside inns, other voices spoke verses. Their names were fainter, their lines fragmentary, yet they too carried whispers that echoed through the centuries. The night deepens, and the lantern flame shrinks to a narrow glow. You and I step away from grand palaces and into smaller, quieter spaces, dusty temples, roadside inns, mountain huts, where smoke rises from a rough hearth. Here lived the forgotten prophets of China, men and women whose names are barely preserved, whose words survive only in fragments, yet whose whispers travelled further than they could have imagined. One such figure was Yuan Tiangang, already famed for co-authoring the Tuibeitu with Li Chunfeng. Beyond that scroll, legends say he wandered the empire, reading people's faces with unnerving accuracy. To meet his gaze, it was said, was to feel as though he could see not only your features but your future. In one tale, he refused to look upon a child destined for greatness, afraid that naming the destiny aloud might upset heaven's balance. In stories like these, prophecy wasn't just about written. For Set it was embodied in a moment of seeing, a glance that carried weight heavier than words. Another name is Liu Ji, better known as Liu Bowen, the Ming statesman credited with the burnt cake song. But rumors attached to him didn't stop there. Later generations attributed countless sayings to him, verses about iron birds flying across the heavens, or thunder moving across the seas. Modern readers sometimes claim these hinted at airplanes or cannons, though in truth they were likely cryptic images drawn from meditation, dreams, or allegories. What mattered wasn't whether they were literal, it was that people kept returning to them, reshaping them to fit whatever new marvel or terror appeared in their age. Then there was Liu Zi, a Taoist recluse, whose disciples recorded scraps of his speech, later gathered as the Liu Zi Yuyan utterances of Master Liu. These were not polished poems but riddling fragments, a mountain splitting in two, a road of fire stretching over water, a bird without wings flying across the world. In his lifetime, perhaps they were meditations on inner truths. Centuries later, each line became a canvas for anxious imaginations. When earthquakes struck, people recalled the mountain splitting. When strange rumors spread of foreign ships, they cited a road of fire over water. Memory reshaped his words into prophecy, giving them power long after he was gone. Picture a traveler in a rural inn, listening to a ragged monk speak of a king rising in the west. The monk might have meant only the setting sun, or a story from his own sect. But to listeners weary of taxes and hunger, it sounded like heaven's promise of change. They carried the words with them, repeating them from village to village, until a vague phrase grew into a banner for rebellion. In this way, prophecy was often less about authorship and more about transmission. The authority of the speaker mattered less than the need of the listener. What unites these forgotten prophets is not grandeur, but intimacy. They did not sit in jeweled halls drafting dynastic destinies. They muttered over tea, spoke in dreams, scribbled in margins. Their words survived precisely because they were strange, fragile, and open-ended. People remembered them not for clarity, but for possibility. And in times of fear, possibility was enough. As we stand together in this dim chamber, Imagine hearing such whispers yourself. Would you dismiss them as nonsense, or would you tuck them into memory, just in case the world shifted and proved them true? That is what countless people did, generation after generation, until fragments became fate. But in the polished corridors of power, prophecy was never just fragments. It became deliberate, sharpened, and wielded with skill. Ministers and emperors learned how to use these verses not merely as whispers of heaven, but as tools of politics, shields, and daggers made of words. The lantern flickers as though stirred by an unseen draught, and now we find ourselves back in the echoing halls of power. If prophecy in roadside inns was rumor and comfort, in the palace it was something else entirely. A weapon. Words that once floated like petals were sharpened into instruments of persuasion. And here, prophecy became as dangerous as any blade. In the late Tang dynasty, imagine an ambitious courtier kneeling before the throne. He holds a scroll close, the paper thin from use, and recites a line. The golden dragon fades, while the white bird rises. To anyone else, it could be metaphor. To the weary emperor, it feels personal. The dragon is himself. His courtier, clever enough to see the emperor's fear, quickly adds that the white bird is loyal, ready to guard the realm. In that moment, the prophecy has been bent into a lever, prying open trust. The emperor relaxes, the courtier gains influence, and a few words on parchment have shifted the balance of power. This was not unusual. Ministers learned to time their scrolls carefully, present the right verse during a crisis, and you could shape imperial policy. Delay too long, and you risked punishment. Too bold, and you might be accused of treason. Every recitation was a gamble. Prophecy in the palace was never neutral. It was performance, a negotiation with fear. Rebels also wielded prophecies like banners. During times of famine or war, when hope thinned, a rebel leader might proclaim, "Heaven has spoken already, the dynasty is finished." He would cite a verse about withered fields or a sun fading behind clouds. Villagers, exhausted and desperate, would listen, and belief, once seeded, grew quickly. Faith in prophecy could turn a hungry crowd into an army. Even dynasties themselves sometimes embraced ominous verses. Why? Because prophecy could soften the blow of failure. If a dynasty collapsed, rulers claimed it was not weakness, but destiny. In this way, prophecy gave dignity to defeat. When the Ming yielded to the Qing, when the Qing later faced rebellion, both sides pointed to the same scrolls. Each claimed heaven had chosen them. Each declared their rise or fall was written long ago. The ambiguity was perfect. It meant nobody could be proven wrong. Do you sense the paradox? Prophecy was supposed to reveal the future, but instead it obscured it. A loyal minister might see a warning to act wisely. A schemer might twist the same verse into justification for betrayal. An emperor, terrified of losing heaven's favor, might lash out at innocence, hoping to silence the whisper. Yet silence itself could be interpreted as omen. How do you rule a land where even quiet is suspicious? And yet, beyond these political games, prophecy had another face. For the people, it was rarely just manipulation. It was a story, a pattern that turned chaos into meaning. When rulers leaned on prophecy, they weren't only tricking others, they were also acknowledging a shared language, a belief that bound emperor and villager alike. All is written, the rulers implied. You are safe within heaven's plan, even if false, the reassurance worked. So, prophecy became both shield and dagger. It could calm or inflame, justify or condemn. Its power did not come from accuracy, but from belief. And belief, once rooted, was stronger than armies. But this leaves us with a haunting question. Why did ordinary people cling so tightly to prophecy, even when it failed them, even when it was used against them? To answer, we must leave the palace once more and return to the villages, where faith in prophecy was not about politics at all, but about surviving the unbearable weight of life. The lantern's circle of light grows faint, as if it too is tired from carrying centuries of whispers. Now we step outside the palaces, beyond courts and scrolls, into the wide fields and cramped cottages, where prophecy meant something different. Here, prophecy was not dagger or shield, not political theatre, it was survival. Life for ordinary people in imperial China was fragile. Floods could sweep away fields overnight, droughts left villages hollow with hunger, taxes demanded grain that families could barely spare. Soldiers arrived without warning, conscripting sons and taking livestock. To live under such weight was to live with uncertainty, so heavy it could crush hope. And yet, Prophecy offered a thread to hold. If fate was already written, then suffering had meaning. If heaven had decreed decline, it had also promised renewal. That belief was enough to keep people steady when everything else shook. Imagine a winter night in a Ming village. A family huddles around a brazier, the wind rattling thin walls. Someone recites a verse heard in the market. After long darkness, dawn will rise. The children stare into the fire, eyes wide. The parents exhale, shoulders softening. For a moment, the cold feels less bitter. The words are not food, not firewood, but they feed something deeper. They say, "Hold on." The vagueness of the verses made them powerful. A bird in the sky, a tree without roots, a river swelling each could be bent to fit whatever hardship or hope lay at hand. If famine struck, people remembered the line about withered fields. If peace returned, they recalled the verse about rivers flowing clear. Prophecy never seemed to fail because it always found a way to match. Beyond comfort, prophecy also gave a sense of justice. Dynasties often felt distant and corrupt, yet when verses foretold the fall of the unjust and the rise of the virtuous, people believed heaven still watched. Even if their own lives were small, their suffering invisible, prophecy whispered that wrongs would one day be righted. The balance of the universe was still intact, but belief was not always gentle. Sometimes prophecy inflamed rather than soothed. A wandering monk might declare that a new king shall rise in the west. Villagers, weary of hunger and taxes, passed the words along. Gatherings formed, hope hardened, rebellion sparked. The same faith that quieted despair could also light fire. In this way, prophecy was lullaby and war drum, depending on how it was heard. You and I can almost hear it now, sitting among villagers by the fire. Their faces are lit by flame, their voices low. They do not ask whether the verse is divine or invented. What matters is that it shapes the shapeless, that it steadies their hearts. Belief itself is the prophecy's power. And so, across centuries, prophecies endured, not because they were always accurate, but because they answered a deeper need, the need for order, for meaning, for hope. They became part of the rhythm of life, as natural as seasons, but history did not stop. Dynasties rose, collapsed, and vanished into dust. Still, the prophecies remained, copied, revised, whispered again. Even in modern times, scholars debate whether the Tuibeitu truly foresaw wars, or whether each age rewrote it to fit itself. People still marvel at the Plum Blossom poems, still repeat stories of Liu Bowen's cryptic lines. Perhaps that is prophecy's truest legacy, not in revealing the future, but in revealing us. Our fears, our hopes, our longing for control. Prophecies are mirrors, showing not tomorrow but the depths of our own need to believe. And now, as our lantern burns low, a final thought lingers. Were the prophets visionaries blessed with heaven's sight, or careful observers who gave voice to what everyone already sensed? The answer may never be clear. Prophecy has always lived in the space between truth and illusion, comfort and danger. But one last secret waits, soft as smoke in the rafters. These prophecies endured not because they foretold dynasties, but because they helped countless people endure their own nights of doubt. In that way, their truest prediction came true, not about emperors, but about us. The lantern is nearly gone now, its flame shrinking into a trembling bead of light. You and I have walked together through centuries, through diagrams and blossoms, through burnt bread and whispered fragments, through the courts of emperors and the huts of peasants. Each step carried the echo of prophecy, a voice half heard, half imagined, that told people their suffering and triumphs were part of a larger design. But as the night folds around us, let the weight of those stories soften. The names of dynasties Tang, Song, Ming, Qing begin to blur like distant mountains in mist. The prophecies that once terrified rulers and consoled peasants drift like smoke, faint but fragrant. What remains is not fear, not the burden of knowing the future, but the gentle truth that human hearts have always longed for meaning. Listen, even in your own time, how familiar that longing is. We read horoscopes, we follow forecasts, we wonder what tomorrow will bring. It is the same thread that pulled villagers to whisper verses by firelight and emperors to clutch scrolls in trembling hands. To want certainty is to be human. To turn that longing into poetry is to make it bearable. So let tonight's journey end not in tension but in calm. Imagine yourself setting down the scrolls, brushing plum petals from your lap, and stepping out into cool night air. Overhead, the sky is vast and silent. Whatever prophecies may have said, the stars remain steady, patient, watching as they always have. Breathe deeply. Feel the stillness of this moment wrap around you like silk. Whatever burdens you carried into this story can rest now. History has done its wandering. Your thoughts can drift the same ways low, quiet, unhurried. The lantern fades. The incense is only a memory. All that is left is the hush of night, and the promise that sleep will come gently, as it always does. May you rest easily, as softly as plum blossoms falling on still water, as silently as ink drying on ancient parchment.